Hello, my name is Milton Denny. I'm a nationally known professional land surveyor. I'm an author, a lecturer, and a student of history, particularly dealing with survey history. One of my favorite people is a colonial surveyor by the name of Andrew Ellicott. Now, you may never heard of him, but he was a good friend of Washington and James Mason and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And he was the person that they went to when they needed boundaries set or states defined. That was Andrew Ellicott. Today, we're going to be looking at his life and sit back and enjoy as Andrew Ellicott is going to come and tell you his life story. My name is Andrew Ellicott. I'm probably the most famous person you never heard of. I was a good friend of George Washington's and Thomas Jefferson's, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, all the founders of the country. Well, my role was a little different than theirs. My role was defining boundaries. My role was as the surveyor of the new republic. I was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in 1754. I came from a family that were known as mechanics. Now, I know today, if you think about a mechanic, you think of Mr. Goodwrench. But in my day, a mechanic was somebody that was mechanically inclined. And my family came from inventors and scientists, invented all kinds of things, like one of the first operating steamboats and designed to build clocks and scientific instruments. And my dad was incredible. My dad's name was Joseph. And he was the son of an immigrant that came from England. And when I was 15 years old, he was a clockmaker, an instrument maker. And so he and I together constructed this clock. I think now it's kind of known as one of the great American treasures. But it's 8 foot tall. And it has 4 faces on it. One gives you all the things you see in a clock, the hours, the minutes, the different places, and all these kind of things. Another part of it gives you all the moons and the phases of the moon and the sun and the stars. And I remember when we were building it, Dad said, "We can do better than this. We need to add a musical box to this that would play musical tunes when it would strike the hour. And you could set it where it would play short tunes and longer tunes. And actually there were 24 settings. And then the 4th window was just a glass that you could look in there and see how it operated. But see, that's the kind of family I came from. Now, in Pennsylvania, you know, we really never felt at home. And so my dad said, you know what we need to do? I mean, we weren't much in the way of farmers. We need to move to Maryland. We need to go to the Pepsico River where land's available. And what we need to do is build a mill. Actually, we didn't build 1, we built 3. And of course, you know, over time, it became a village, Ellicott City. In fact, if you've been keeping up with things, we just had the 6th major flood of the history of Ellicott City. So we moved to Maryland. And Dad's great idea was we would build a mill and we would give the seed free to the farmers. And they could plant their crops they hadn't planted before. Not just cotton, but wheat and barley and grain. And then when it was ripe, they would have to bring it to us to mill. And it was an instant success. We actually had changed the economy of the whole area. And while I was learning, I met this fair little lass. Her name was Sarah Brown. And oh, I loved her so much. And we got married. If she would have only known what kind of a family that she was marrying into. A family of surveyors. Now, surveyors just are not known to ever make a good living. Because when a job is done, it's hard to get another job. And so many times in our life, she had to go from job to job with me and place to place as things changed in our life. But she was so faithful, and she was such a, and I called her Sally, my lovely Sally. Now, as I mentioned, the problem with being a surveyor is traveling around. And one of the problems with traveling around, that you're away from home. And so I got to be well known for the letters that I would write to Sally and to Mr. Jefferson and to Mr. Franklin and all these other people. And they kept these letters. When I look back now and think about all the time that I spent away from home, I'm almost ashamed. But we did have 10 children, so I did get home occasionally, you know. Well, during the war, there is only one war. It was called the American Revolution from English government. I served as a major in the Elks Ridge Battalion in Maryland. Now, kind of disappointing to me was that we were like a home guard, and we really never saw any real action. But one day the war was over, and people like Mr. Jefferson were trying to decide, like, how do you start a country? Well, besides having a financial system and having laws and government and representatives and all that, you needed to know what the boundary of the country was. And so he wrote me letters. One of the first things that he wanted to accomplish was to finish the surveying of the Mason-Dixon line. Now, I know probably somebody in here has heard of the Mason-Dixon line. These were two English surveyors that came over, and they were settle a dispute between Ted Turner and Donald Trump. No. Their names were Lord Baltimore and William Penn. I just got history mixed up there. And they came from England, and they surveyed. And this has happened to every surveyor many times, you know. They laid out the boundaries of around Philadelphia and split them up and all that. And then the higher-up said, you know, while you're here, why don't you survey a permanent line to the west? Now, something you have to understand. A lot of these early lines were done on latitude and longitude. Okay? For some of you scientifically challenged, latitude is north and south, and longitude is east and west, okay? Latitude is a piece of cake. I mean, your dog could learn how to do latitude. It's longitude, because the Earth is turning, and you've got to take into account the rotation and the speed and all this kind of thing. So they picked latitudes. They picked a latitude for the Mason-Dixon line, 15 miles south of the city of Philadelphia. Well, Mason-Dixon were sitting around waiting to get the go-ahead to do it, and they started building more houses south of Philadelphia. Finally, they got so frustrated, they went and put a big X on one house and said, we don't care how many more houses, that's the house we're going to use. Oh, they started out with great grandeur. And I can relate to this because I did surveys that same way. And They had 120 men, and they had stones built, cut in England for them, and they started surveying west on a great circle of arc, not a straight line. If you want a latitude, you've got to survey on a circle. And so they started, and they were experimenting with different ways of doing that. And after about 2 years, they only had 16 men left. And all this while, the natives are starting to say, "What are you doing? This is our land out here. You go back to the coast where you white people belong. This is our land." Well, they got 234 miles, and the 6 Indian tribes got together. You know, the Iroquois and all the English, all the northeastern tribes, and they confronted them. There was a great Indian trail, and that was important to the Indians because the buffalo worked that trail. And so the Indians confronted Mason and Dixon, said, "If you cross that line, we're going to kill you all." And Mason and Dixon said, "You know, this is probably a good place to stop." And so when the Revolutionary War was over, I get a letter from Mr. Jefferson saying, "You know what, we need to extend that line all the way out to the Ohio River. And then we need to start setting the boundaries of states." Okay? And so they did that. We actually, was the first really big job I had, with a commission of men, Mr. Rittenhouse, Mr. James Mason, and other people were on that survey. And we did that, okay? And then the next year, Mr. Jefferson said, "Well, Andrew, back," well, he didn't call me Andrew, he called me Mr. Ellicott. "Mr. Ellicott, back that line up to 5 degrees from the city of Philadelphia of longitude, and that'll be the westerly boundary of the state of Pennsylvania." And so I did that, I surveyed that, and then he said, "You know, the state of Pennsylvania needs access to that Great Lake in their northwest corner, and go there and survey this town of Erie, and they're going to annex that to Pennsylvania." So I did that. I heard rumors about this great falls of the river. I don't know about you, but I've always been like that in my life. If I heard something or somebody, I had to find out whether this was really true or not. And so I went to this great falls. Folks, it was unbelievable. It was so big and so huge and so wide. I measured the height and I measured the length. I made drawings of it and took it back to Mr. Jefferson of this, what they called Niagara Falls. Well, let me tell you about the colonies. They didn't all like each other. There were little colonies and big colonies, and there were industrial colonies, and then there were strictly agricultural colonies. And everybody feared Pennsylvania. You know, they were the proverbial 500-pound gorilla. They could take over. And that's what most people expected. Pennsylvania would just take over the United States. So there was a compromise worked out about a federal city. I think you call it Washington today, but then it was the federal city. And what we're going to do is we're going to move to some neutral ground. And we're going to set up this federal city, and that way, no one state owns this capital. Pretty interesting idea. And so I get a letter from Mr. Jefferson and from George Washington saying that we're going to make you the survey commissioner of this project. The land was worthless. It was swamps. And while I was used to working in a lot of swamps, this was a big swamp. But the agreement was made that these people that owned that land would give that land. By the way, the government had no money. Kind of reminds you of today, doesn't it? They were broke. And so they said, okay, if you donate the land, then when we get to places we're going to build government buildings, we'll give you back the rest of the land and you can sell the lots. So that was the agreement. Well, Mr. Washington, he hired a French engineer, Mr. Pierre Lafont. And he was known for having laid out major cities in Europe and like a spoke of a wheel, and oh, this was supposed to be a grand thing. But when he started doing this and we started laying it out, all of a sudden people are saying, well, roads 200 feet wide? There ain't going to be any land left to sell. And so it got into a lot of conflict. Mr. Lafont said, oh no, we're going to do it my way. And finally, Mr. Washington let him go. So Jefferson came to me and said, can you handle this? I said, yes, I don't have his maps, but I know what he had done. I know what we'd done, and I can finish this job. Do you ever work on something where there's all these different people involved? Everybody's got their idea of the way it ought to be. And I can tell you that I have never been much of a politician. I'm a scientist. In fact, people have said I'm kind of pompous and arrogant and hard to get along with. And some of that may be true. And so these people and they're saying that maybe you need a commission of all these people that will come in and grade what I had done. I can remember sitting down with quill in hand and writing Mr. Jefferson. What right do people of inferior intelligence to me have to question my perfect survey work? That ended it. That was the end. They accepted my map, and my map is on record. It is the official map of Washington, D.C., as you call it today. Oh, I get into one of those periods where I didn't have a lot of work and things weren't going well, and we had a lot of children and things. But we survived. I did private surveys for people, which I didn't really like to do, because there was always this question about getting paid. And so finally, Mr. Jefferson writes me a letter. Said, we're going to appoint you the commissioner of a survey expedition to survey 31 degrees of latitude from the Mississippi River to the state of Georgia. When I got done, I found out that was 381 miles. This was the kind of job I liked. So I got a government authorization to start buying some boats. I should have known right from the beginning this was not going to be easy. I didn't have time to have boats built. My nature is I would have wanted to build boats. But I didn't have time, so I had to buy some boats. I bought a Kentucky flatboat because we had 70 men totally, and we had 30 soldiers, which came back to kind of haunt us later on because it wasn't supposed to be a military operation. And then I had my boat, which was a keel boat, but it was a pitiful looking thing. It had been scraped over the rocks in the river so many times there were holes you could see in the bottom of it. But we had to do it. So we met in Pittsburgh in 1796 in the fall. And since October The river had been as low as it had ever been in the history of people dealing with the Ohio River. And so we had to leave. We just loaded up our boats and we left. Well, my poor little old keel boat didn't get far, and it was leaking all over the place. But we ran into Mr. Wilkinson, and he was coming up the river from the western lands. That's what they called the area to the west, the western lands. And he saw my predicament, and he said, well, let's just trade boats. And so I traded his boat. Now, his boat wasn't a new boat, but it had a new cabin on it. It was pretty nice. So we swapped boats. And he took my boat the rest of the way, and then I took his boat. But we kept getting caught on shoals and getting planks ripped out of the bottom, and we'd have to cut and saw trees so we could replank the. But finally, little by little, we worked our way down the river. It was fascinating. Stopped in places like Marietta and Cincinnati. They were all there. And then stopped at the Great Cave. There's a great cave along the river where robbers would waylay the people coming into the country and steal all their goods. But I had 70 men, so I didn't have to worry about that. But then eventually got down to Louisville. We were received amazingly well in Louisville. And we had dinner and then we start out. Now we're talking middle of December. We left in November, middle of December. Not only was the water the lowest it ever been, the temperatures and the cold were record. I guess it's global warming, right? And it was record cold. And I can remember when we left Louisville, we went down to a shoals, and there was a flat bottom boat that was hung up on some logs. And I told my men, I said, I'll bet you those people are on shore because they couldn't get that boat off those logs. And so I said, well, get a boat and go over there and see. And sure, first thing we saw was a fire, and we saw it, and there were 2 men and 3 women and a bunch of children. And they would have surely frozen to death. But I told my men, I said, go ahead, get in the water and pull that boat free and repair that boat. And we put them in that boat and we sent them on our way. That was when I really started to realize that I had a very special group of men that would do that. When they climbed back in the boat, the clothes were frozen. I mean, it was like 10 degrees above zero. But surely that family would have died. Well, we got on down to the place where the Ohio River and the Mississippi come together. And that's a pretty historic place right there. And so Mr. Jefferson wanted to know where that was. So we pulled our boats up on shore and we did observations. We were there about 30 days. And it's a good thing we did because the whole river iced in. It was unbelievable how cold it got that winter. But we survived. And come a break in the weather in February, we started down and we went to Natchez, Mississippi. See, there was this Treaty of Trent that was signed between Spain and the United States government. And it has to do with the boundaries and who controls the river. Well, see, the Spanish government wanted to control the Mississippi River, which we didn't get. And we got harassed by them. But we got down to Natchez, and I got out my sextant, and I took a reading. And guess what? Natchez was above 31 degrees. And the Spanish government had never considered giving up Natchez, Mississippi, or Natchez, the Mississippi Territory. Never considered that. that was part of their domain. That was a wonderful seaport. So when I gave them the results that the line 31 degrees was 20 miles south, oh, they just didn't like that at all. In fact, they kicked me out of Natchez, which was good because I took my men north of Natchez and camped in a nice area where there was clean water. And they had a typhoid epidemic in Natchez and killed a lot of people. And my people didn't get killed because we were living outside of Natchez. That was some of the most frustrating days of my life. That thing went on and on and on, and they couldn't change the treaty because the Pope had signed the treaty on behalf of Spain. So it was really a treaty between the Pope and the United States. Finally, after well over a year, I think the Spanish finally realized that they were just going to have to live with it. And so, like all that many times happens, is you need a solution to this problem that allows people to kind of save face, if you know what I mean. And so the agreement was this. And I was meddling around in this thing. Probably almost started a war. But the agreement was this, that the city of Natchez would declare their independence from Spain. And Spanish would leave. And then the next day I would come in there and claim Natchez for the new United States. And we pulled that off. We pulled that off. But I think we almost started a war. But we finally got Spain to leave. See, the problem was Spain was trying to infiltrate further and further up into what United States considered their territory. At least Mr. Jefferson did. So we finally got to the place, after 2 years, to start running the line. My wife was starting to really wonder about this, why I even gotten involved in this in the first place. But after 2 years, we finally got to surveying on the line. But you know, after all these years, my memory isn't quite what it once was. I think I'm as smart as I ever was, but I don't think my memory is as good. So I brought along a couple letters that I wrote to my wife that will kind of explain some things to you. This is before we left on the line of 31 degrees. And again, away from home. This was in this is in New Orleans. Wait a minute. Okay. We're working on Erie, Pennsylvania, in that area up there, the boundaries of Pennsylvania. My dear Sally, we are yet stationed at this place, but will shortly have to leave it and return home. Not by the command of Captain Cornplanter, Woodbug, dogs of the fire, hot bread, hot ashes, big boil of a kettle, broken twig, standing stone, flying cloud, bear's oil, mud eater, big fish carrier, old turkey, the terrapin, snake, or he can't find it, 20 canoes, or any other two-legged king of this country, but by the command of a more powerful monarch, which now making a violent attack on my fingers and toes, and this is King Frost. We are all in a fine state of health, but almost naked for the want of clothes. As yet we have been able to keep ourselves moderately warm with blankets and bearskins. As a woman, we know nothing about them except by recollection. We have not seen one of any color for nearly 4 months. Without joking, I expect we shall certainly receive orders to return in less than 2 weeks. And then I just went on and told about what else was going on with the Indians. And I closed I am, my dear Sally, your loving husband. And I called Sarah Sally. And I wanted to read one more to you. We're still in the same place. My dear Sally, this is in August 1794. We yet continue very quietly at this place, having no communication with the Indians and having no intelligence from Philadelphia since the 23rd of June. And if no direction should come, on the contrary, we shall leave this place for Philadelphia next Sunday, 2 weeks. Brother Benjamin, and many times that I went, my brothers went with me. We went as a whole family. And does anybody know why that is? Because these were the only people we could trust. There was no law and order. There were no sheriffs, or there were no military troops. You were on your own. The only people you could trust was your family. So I took my brothers and my uncles, and we all worked together. We live here like a parcel of monks or hermits, and have not a woman of any complexion among us. Our linen is dirty, our faces and hands brown, and complete the picture, our beards are generally long. O sweet woman, without thee man is a brute, and society a blank. Thou shapest man into a valuable thing, and directest his ambition to useful pursuit. Can that man be possessed of rational sensibility who doeth not a woman? May God preserve you and our sweet children. My kindest regards to Mr. Gaff. By the way, I also got word that one of my children had died. So when we finally got to doing the survey, 31 degrees, you know, that's an important line. That's the line of Alabama and Florida. That's what I surveyed. When we started surveying, I realized that this was going to be unlike any other survey I had ever done. And the problem was this, that there was all these swamps, and you just couldn't have wagons and men. In fact, the first 20 miles was this giant cane. It was called Arunda scientifica. It gets up to 6 inches in diameter and grows 30 to 40 feet high. And the first 20 miles of that line, they were so close together you couldn't walk between them. My men worked. And at the pace we were going, that first 20 miles, it was going to take us at least 12 years to do the rest of the line. Luckily, after 20 miles, the cane was gone. But that first 20 miles was just horrible. But I realized that we needed a different method of doing this work. So I went to New Orleans with the sole intention of buying a boat big enough that I could sail it down the Mississippi, around into the Gulf, and I could go to the major rivers and come up the major rivers and supply the men as they came to each river, okay? I got to New Orleans for this thing called Mardi Gras, which that wasn't why I was there. In fact, people do really crazy things. And they going around and throw beads at you and do all this crazy. That wasn't me at all. In fact, I wrote Sally a letter. My dearest of all earthly beings. Husbands, try that on your wife sometime. You might find that actually works pretty well. My dearest of all earthly beings, I have now been in this place 6 days. It is carnival or holiday time. It is supposed that I come on a visit in consequence of which I have been treated with singular attention and parade. But this is not the case. That's not why I'm here. My business is different from that of pleasure. I have obtained some very important information which I have sent to our Secretary of State. Pray be careful not to mention anything of the above. Mr. Freeman, and he was one of the surveyors that had come with him that worked on Washington, D.C., is one of the greatest rascals and liars in existence. He has done everything in his power to put a stop to our business. And it was with difficulty that I could, for some months, prevent a duel between him and Andrew. Oh, I didn't tell you about the washerwoman. When we stopped in Cincinnati, there was this young girl, and she was washing for people. And I had my 16-year-old son, Andrew, along, and he was smitten. And so, against my greater judgment, when we left to go to New Orleans, or went to go to Natchez, he asked if we could bring her along to do our laundry. Well, the only thing was this Thomas Freeman, he liked her too. So all of a sudden I got this triangle going on, and Freeman being a much older man and skilled in the way of weapons, and I thought he was going to duel and kill Andrew. So I eventually got rid of him. My business with the Spanish government has been difficult and complex, but I have at length succeeded in everything I had in view. I shall write to you several times before I leave this town and send you some curiosities with my picture by the first vessel which goes to Baltimore or Philadelphia. Adieu, my love. See, the letter that he intercepted was a cryptic letter. And it was from Wilkinson, the same guy that gave him the boat. And what it outlined in this letter was that there were certain generals in the United States Army that were receiving payments from Spain, so if this new government wouldn't make it, they would be in a place to come in and take over. Because that's what Spain wanted to do, was take this over. Naive man to think I couldn't decipher his letter. Simple deciphered letter, that's no problem. So I deciphered it and then sent it on to the secretary for action. Came back later on to kind of haunt me a little bit. Well, we continued working on the line and made progress, and about halfway, we wanted to set a major stone. What we were setting along the line were earthen mounds. I mean, there's no rock down there. I mean, I came from places where there were stones and rocks, and you could chisel on them, and there was no rock down there. About halfway at a place called the Mobile Delta, there was a rock outcropping, and we quarried a big rock, and we set that rock there. It's still there today. 1799, Spain on one side, U.S. on the other. And that actually became the starting point for surveys in Alabama eventually. But that's another whole story. But we continued to make progress. And finally, when we got pretty much to Georgia, we needed a way of getting home. And so my men chose to walk through the south line of Georgia there all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And I sailed the Sally around the coast of Florida and stopped in places along the Florida Keys. Somebody had told me about these hot streams of water that were going offshore, so I would be checking it with my temperature and found the Gulf Stream coming up. And well, we came back up the side of Florida there faster than you ever believed. But I eventually got home. Got a freighter, sent the Sally back around to Mobile, and got home. A great homecoming. See my children. But I got to share one other thing with you. Before we finish the line, I was sitting in a tent near Pensacola doing spherical trigonometry. And I got a letter from Sally. And I had to write her right back. It said, "My love, it is with inexpressible concern that I learned the death of our youngest child." That's the second one now. That when I was out of town, I should have been there. I wasn't there for him. That was the life I chose. And while people called me pompous and arrogant, I had a mission to do. Establish the boundaries of this country. When I got back, the governor of Pennsylvania hired me to be the secretary of surveying in Pennsylvania. Actually, Jefferson offered me the job of Secretary General of the whole United States, and I turned it down because it had been right out in the wilderness again. And I just didn't feel I could put Sally through that. And those were pretty good times. I worked at that job, and it was local, and we bought a house, the first time we'd ever owned a structure, and we lived there, and we were comfortable. And I was doing other things along with my work. And then this is what happened. The new governor of Pennsylvania happened to be an ally of Mr. Wilkinson. So just like that, they let me go. I didn't find this out until quite a few years later, where Sally had written to my brother Joseph. Now, my brother Joseph, who never married in his life and had no children, but was extremely wealthy and was a land speculator and actually surveyed most of the land in upstate New York. And Sally wrote to him, and I had just sold my library of books. That doesn't sound that important to you. But see, who we are was in those books. How else would we know how to do spherical trigonometry or calculus if we didn't have those books? There weren't schools teaching that. And so, without a job, Sally had written to Joseph and says what was going on, and I had just sold my library, and we were really in desperate straits, and he sent her money, which I didn't find out until later because she knew I wouldn't approve, but it happened. Well, my friend Thomas Jefferson started looking out for me. But while I was in that Pennsylvania job, I did publish the journal of my trip. And it was sold around the world because I documented in there all the animals and the trees and all the other information that people were interested what was in this continent of the United States. It gave me just a little bit of fame. But now I'm without a job. Well, my friend, Mr. Jefferson, I guess he knew it was kind of a low point in my life. I had been gone so much. I guess today you'd almost say I abused my family, although that never really occurred to me. but I was without a job. And men are supposed to have a job. Men are supposed to take care of their families. Luckily, by now, most of my children were adults and had left home. So it really just was Sally and I. And then Mr. Jefferson writes me a letter. He said, "How would you like to be the professor of mathematics at West Point and teach?" I had taught one other time at the Academy of Baltimore, and teach these young men math and science. So what went from a very low point in my life ended up to be some of the very best years that I was the professor of mathematics. Well, the association of those young men and the eagerness to learn was just unbelievable. It was really a great time. I was able to go and do some other things, and I took a survey in Georgia, which turned out to be the worst survey that I ever did, and it was horrible in the mountains, and then I didn't get paid, and I just asked them recently, and they still won't pay me. But you know, some people say that I died in 1820. But I'm here today to tell you that surveyors don't die. They live on in every courthouse, in every line, and in the Ellicott stone, and all the maps and the plats and the boundaries that we establish. So surveyors never die. I am sincerely yours, Andrew Ellicott.